Signs of a military deadlock as pro-democracy forces in Libya struggle in their fight against Gaddafi's army. Just what are the options as the conflict lingers into stalemate? And what does the rebels' talk of ceasefire really mean? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Seeker. On the battlefields of Libya, it appears the fighting has reached something of an impasse. Momentum has shifted between Gaddafi forces and pro-democracy fighters, but neither side has made any significant advances since the uprising against Muammar Gaddafi's rule began more than 6 weeks ago. The international airstrikes on his forces haven't done much to change that. And while a growing number of diplomats and senior officials have defected from Gaddafi's regime, the man who has ruled Libya for 4 decades remains firmly entrenched in Tripoli. It all has the look and feel of a conflict in stalemate, and that's what we'll be looking at on the programme. First, this report from Lawrence Lee.
Another week's end in what they call Free Libya. Another expression, routine now, of defiance against Gaddafi in Benghazi. But it's been a poor week for the opposition forces, even backed as they are by foreign warplanes. Their retreat and inability to stand up to Gaddafi's army has led to apparently anguished discussions at the transitional government here about their military structure at the front line.
We'll take some measures, and it could include some changes.
Should we expect a change in military leadership?
Maybe.
If it was the death of fear that led to the uprising, it's the fear of death that keeps pushing the rebels back. Something's got to change. The latest intelligence from the American military establishment suggests that Gaddafi's ground forces outnumber the rebels by 10 to 1, and that's discounting their obvious military superiority. Hardly surprising then that the people here keep calling for more help from the outside world. Which makes it even more disconcerting for the opposition that there are such mixed messages from the coalition as to whether or not they want to arm the rebels. While some have said the United Nations resolution does allow for it, others on either practical or more philosophical grounds are saying it shouldn't happen.
In terms of providing assistance to them, frankly, there are many countries that can do that. That's not a unique capability for the United States, and as far as I'm concerned, somebody else should do that.
With regard to arming the rebels, our view at the moment is negative. In other words, we don't view such a decision. In our view, this could also create an environment which would be conducive to terrorism, and that would in itself be dangerous.
None of it's to say that the rebels are necessarily losing, just that neither side is muscular enough to win outright. Rebels demand strong advice from the outside world if they're to do something decisive. It's not happening at the moment. Lawrence Lee, Al Jazeera, Benghazi.
So a lot to talk about there, and joining me now to discuss this are our 3 guests. From London, Seamus Milne, Associate Editor of The Guardian newspaper. Milne has reported extensively from the Middle East. From Dubai, Mohammed Ali Abdullah, Deputy Secretary General of the Libyan opposition group National Front for the Salvation of Libya. And again from London, James Spencer, defence analyst specialising in the Middle East and North Africa. Spencer was a former military major in the British Army. Now, Mr. Spencer, if I could start with you. A military stalemate in Libya is what the coalition had hoped to avoid when they began airstrikes on Gaddafi's forces more than 2 weeks ago. Yet that is exactly what appears to be happening now. Is there a way out of this?
Yes, it's the way all wars eventually end, and that's by coming to a political conclusion. Negotiations started, one side has offered, the other side has refused, presumably because they think that they're in a more advantageous position, or because the conditions that have been set are not satisfactory, and they will continue to happen. There may well be some more rounds of fighting, but ultimately all wars end through political compromise. All right, let's put that to Mohammed Abdullah. The opposition government in Benghazi has floated this idea of a conditional ceasefire. That has been swiftly rejected in Tripoli, not surprisingly. Is this a sign of weakness from the opposition then, and perhaps the acknowledgement that things are not going their way on the battlefield?
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, the discussion regarding the ceasefire was not a proposal made by the National Council, the Transitional National Council. It was a reaction to a comment made by the UN representative in Benghazi on his trip, indicating that Tripoli was willing to negotiate for a ceasefire based on specific conditions that were not made public, but in private meetings. Basically, those conditions meant that Libya would be divided. And Mr. Mustafa Abdul Jalil's response on the spot was that that's categorically refused, and the only way we would discuss a ceasefire is if Gaddafi's forces were to pull out of all the cities and the blockade on all these cities would be removed. Now, if that's not an acceptable condition, then I don't think there's actually any grounds for any kind of political discussions that would include Gaddafi remaining in power. That is something that's completely, I think it's a disrespect to this revolution. It is something that is far-fetched, and I think even for the international community's perspective has made it very clear that Gaddafi's legitimacy is no longer on all fronts. So therefore, any kind of political discussion or conclusion that includes Gaddafi or anyone from his circle remaining in power is absolutely unacceptable.
Well, you say that, Mr. Abdullah, but the airstrikes may have helped to some degree, but the reality is that they're not allowing your forces to push any further. The two sides are now stuck on the battlefield. Isn't it time for some type of political resolution here?
I think here one of the issues here, I think, and why the picture is not very clear, is people want to take a neutral side, and this discussion there is no neutral side. I don't think you can be neutral when one side, meaning Muammar Gaddafi, is using his arms, his mercenaries, to attack unarmed civilians on the first front. Okay, so I think we have to get away from this trying to portray as if we have a neutral two-party disagreement where there's a clear picture of an evil leader who's trying to basically outright wipe out his country. So this is the first point. Now, to come back to the airstrikes, I agree with you. The airstrikes have not been effective, and I don't know what's the issues. We've heard the weather had an indication. The transition to the NATO leadership also could have possibly had an influence on that. But the airstrikes have definitely not prevented civilian loss, which is the primary objective of this resolution 1973. In the last 5 or 6 days, we've had over 100 civilians killed in Misrata, in Zintan, and the surrounding Western Mountains area. So therefore, I think the question needs to be asked, what is the role of the NATO forces now?
All right, Seamus Milne, I know you were opposed to any type of foreign military intervention in this from the beginning, but given that we have reached some type of impasse now, doesn't this really make the calls for a political solution even louder now?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the intervention by NATO forces, by Western countries which have invaded and occupied Iraq, intervened in Afghanistan and occupied Afghanistan and Pakistan, and are killing civilians all over the place and backing regimes all over the Middle East that are killing civilians now, was a tragedy. And of course, the NATO forces themselves, as we've seen in the last few days, are killing civilians themselves. And what we need to see now is an end to the fighting as soon as possible to stop that killing. And that can only happen now unless there's a collapse in the Gaddafi regime, an implosion internally, which of course is possible, but there don't seem to be that clear signs of it at the moment. With the stalemate on the battlefield and the NATO forces not in a position, for both their own reasons and the fact that it's an air campaign, to intervene decisively, there has to be some kind of negotiated settlement which would not divide the country, which is what's happening now, but allow some kind of political future which would allow the Libyan people to choose their own political path. And that's what needs to happen now.
Sorry to interrupt, but do you really believe that that's going to happen, that there's going to be a political solution that involves one Libya with the way Colonel Gaddafi has dug his heels in Tripoli?
Well, I mean, there are two sides that have dug in at the moment. I mean, once this became a military conflict rather than a popular uprising, it was inevitable that there would be two sides in the conflict, and at the moment they're in a stalemate, and they're both refusing the terms of the other side. I don't think that's surprising, because both are looking to see who's got the advantage, and the rebel side is hoping that the NATO forces can tip the balance further in their direction to get a better deal. But I think, you know, in a way, the the initiative by the Turkish government and others to try and play the role of mediator to bring some kind of political solution to the conflict is the way to go, unless there's some dramatic turn of events on either side.
All right, let's put that to Mohammed Al-Abdallah. Do you believe that if there is some type of a political solution here, it would be more palatable if it were to come from Middle Eastern nations, Muslim nations like Turkey or Egypt? Is that a more viable solution?
Well, I think in a theoretic world, yes, it would be. But I think one thing we have to make clear here is that this whole situation in Libya, this whole handling of the international community of this situation reflects one fact that I think all of us can agree on, is that this is a very abnormal situation. Colonel Gaddafi is a very abnormal person. His leadership is by far not orthodox. The way he's handling his country is not, in any way providing a playing field where any kind of diplomatic negotiations is possible. And that's been made clear by everyone who's tried, including the Turkish government, who's given us that kind of feedback. So therefore, I think we have to be a bit more practical and stop talking in a theoretic world. Now, theoretically speaking, yes, someone like Gaddafi should have never brought in mercenaries to kill his own people. Someone like Gaddafi should not have put the country in this situation. So again, back to my initial point, is that the whole concept here is not two equal sides trying to fight for power. This is a revolution that was militarized by Gaddafi, by him firing, shelling, and bombing from the air his own people. This revolution needs to come back to its peaceful origins, okay? And this whole revolution started as a peaceful demonstration in the cities of Benghazi, Al-Bayda, Misrata, Zintan, and others, and this is where it needs to come back to. And I think the only way to come back to that is if the Gaddafi forces are held back. And coming back to this point, the whole point of 1973 UN Security Council resolution is to put an end to the Gaddafi forces attacking the civilians, which is not being done at this point. And I think the diplomatic pressure that can be put on Gaddafi has to be in parallel with the airstrikes of NATO, preventing his forces and his brigades from attacking civilians.
What kind of diplomatic pressure? What kind of diplomatic pressure do you want to see? Because so far it hasn't worked.
Yeah, diplomatic pressure. For example, a lot of the delegates that Gaddafi is sending abroad, okay, right now, these delegates are still being, or trying to negotiate some kind of a solution where Gaddafi remains in power or hands over power to one of his sons. That has to be completely taken off the table. Okay, so that option has to be removed, and I think the British government has made that clear in these discussions with Mohammed Ismail, who was the latest delegate. The other thing is that there are tens of Gaddafi's agents that are moving around in Europe and in Middle Eastern countries who are still trying to hide his funds, trying to provide equipment such as cars and telephones and other types of equipment to get around the blockade of the UN Security Council. These people have to be held accountable for their actions. I think that if that's done, then the diplomatic pressure it will escalate on Gaddafi, and he will have to seek some kind of an exit for himself, which is already, by the way, in discussions with some other third parties.
James Spencer, if I could turn to you on this. I know you believe that military intervention in Libya was the right thing to do in terms of the responsibility to protect civilians there, but people will make the same argument about other Arab uprisings in Bahrain, in Yemen, to name just a couple. I mean, what's so special about Libya? Why Libya?
Several reasons. First of all, there was an Arab League and in fact the Organisation of the Islamic Conference, the African Union, all expressed concern about the militarization of the repression. Secondly, to be brutally honest, it was a great deal earlier on, it was a great deal simpler than it would be to intervene in Bahrain, in Yemen or in various other places, because you had armoured vehicles, very clear lines of front lines and one side and the other. In places like Yemen, in places like Bahrain, you tend to have civilians protesting against the state and counter-protesting, so it's far harder to do. Nobody has said this is perfect, and judging by the look of things, the UNSCR 1973 was slightly rushed in order to prevent the slaughter that was imminent on Benghazi. And I have no problems in doing a little bit of good rather than not doing anything at all.
All right, let's put that to Seamus Milne then, that international intervention, according to James Spencer, was the right thing to do, and all of these other Arab uprisings were fraught with drawbacks.
Well, it would have been much more easy for the Western powers that actually back the Bahrain regime, that actually back the Jordanian regime, that back the Yemeni regime, simply to withdraw their support. We're not asking for military intervention there, just to withdraw their existing support for regimes which are carrying out massacres right now. But they didn't do that. Instead, they've intervened militarily in a conflict in the heart of the Arab world. Once again, the same powers that colonized and have intervened in the Arab world for decades and decades, and at the core of the problem which the Arab Revolution is seeking to overcome, namely the imposition and the maintenance of tyrannies throughout the region that have denied them their rights. And the tragedy for Libya is that the Libyan people's opposition has been hijacked by those same Western powers. I mean, increasingly, your guest from the National Salvation Front of Libya talks about the Libyan people taking control, but they're not in control of their own opposition anymore. His own organization has long-standing links with the CIA and American and British intelligence. So do other parts of the Libyan opposition, and now there are British special forces and American special forces on the ground in the east of Libya, actually taking over effectively the running of that area. And that's not about self-determination for the Arabs or for the Libyans, and that's what we need to get back to. This whole revolutionary process throughout the region is about the Arabs taking control of their own region and their own destinies, and that is being hijacked and diverted by this Libyan intervention. Either the Arabs will make their own revolution, or it won't be a revolution at all.
Yeah, Mohammed, in Dubai, Seamus Milne brings up the point there that if foreign forces, if it's going to take foreign forces to remove Gaddafi from power, then it's not really an authentic Arab uprising, is it?
No, he's absolutely correct, is that this revolution needs to come back to the hands of the Libyan people. And nobody mentioned that we require foreign forces to go in and actually end the Gaddafi regime. What we're asking for is the execution of Resolution 1973. And to come back on his point that he threw out there about the Libyan opposition. They are effectively doing
that, though, aren't they? I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, they are not. They are not. I'm sorry.
If they're bombing Gaddafi's targets, they are aiding your forces, whether directly or indirectly. That's essentially what they're doing, isn't it?
I'm not talking about bombing Gaddafi's forces in certain locations. I'm talking about an all-out execution of Resolution 1973, which is to protect civilians. In the last 5 or 6 days alone, over 100 people have been killed in the cities of Misrata, Zintan, Nalut, and other places. And the NATO forces have not done anything. There are, as we speak right now, Gaddafi's forces are gathering in force around the cities of Ghrian, Nalut, Yifrin, in the western mountains and outside of Misrata, and we have not heard of any kind of airstrikes whatsoever. So this is the point I want to come back to. Coming back to the initial comment about the Libyan opposition, and specifically the National Front for the Salvation of Libya, our ties with the U.S. government or with any other agencies, it does not mean that we gave up control of our destiny or of our fate to these people. We have been in dialogue with these people. We have been in discussions with many. There are organizations that have supported the Libyan opposition, including Arab, Western European, as well as the American forces. However, that does not mean that we compromised our principles or we compromised the control of our fate. And this is why the National Front of the Salvation of Libya remains as today, after 30 years, steadfast in its position and its opposition. When the Western regime, including the United States and UK, turned their back against the Libyan people and opened their hands up and their wallets up for Muammar Gaddafi, the National Front and the Libyan opposition withstood their ground. We did not join that mandate that was, if you want to call it a mandate, to sort of open arms, welcome Gaddafi, the murderer, back into the international community. So therefore, the fate and the control of our mission and our objective to, number one, end the Gaddafi regime and to establish a constitutional democracy in Libya remains in Libyan hands and will always remain in Libyan hands, and it will be executed and achieved by Libyans.
All right, I know Seamus Milne, you want to respond to some of that?
Well, I mean, the tragedy is that is not what's happening. I mean, by relying on Western air support from the same regimes that have invaded and occupied Afghanistan and Iraq and have supported Arab dictatorships for decades and decades, the Libyan opposition, or big part of it, has effectively given up power and control to those forces. They will decide what level of air support the Libyan rebels will have. They will decide when the settlement will be made, because once the conflict became a military conflict, it was an issue between two military forces, and clearly the Libyan rebels are not able to prevail in that state, and obviously would have been overrun eventually without Western air support and the NATO forces are intervening in support of the Libyan rebels right now, not to the extent clearly that your guest would like, but they evidently are. They're attacking the Gaddafi forces when they're in conflict. And that goes beyond, in fact, Resolution 1973, which of course isn't supported by many of the most important countries and largest countries in the world. I mean, there's a lot of talk about the international community, but actually the international community is not in support of this intervention, which is yet another Western intervention in an Arab and Muslim country and is poisoning the whole revolutionary process throughout the Arab world.
All right, I saw our other two guests shaking their heads there to some of what you were saying there, Seamus Milne, but I want to bring this back to James Spencer, if I can. Does the international community risk a type of mission creep here by getting sucked into this, into what has so far been a small-scale intervention? And when they do get further involved in this, if they do get further involved in this, doesn't this play into the hands of Gaddafi when he says that this is just another colonial war?
It was almost inevitable that mission creep would happen, and to an extent people realise that. If you look at the UNSCR, it's quite carefully crafted to rule out all sorts of things. There's no armed mercenaries are supposed to go in. That pretty much rules out a sand line in Sierra Leone scenario. No forces of occupation, which rules out specifically an occupation of Libya and functionally a resubordination of Libya. So they were very well aware of it. The issue of protecting civilians again has come out. The NATO has already said that they have reminded the rebels that they are there to protect civilians, full stop, from whoever is killing them, be that loyalists or the rebels, and they have been very clear on that. One of the issues that has happened is that Gaddafi's forces have worked out that they don't actually face an armoured enemy. They face very light role enemy who have very limited protection, so they have no need necessarily to trundle around in armoured vehicles like tanks and self-propelled guns, which are very, very obvious and very good targets for coalition air forces. So they've gone into exactly the same sort of technicals functionally as the rebels have, which makes it very, very difficult to discriminate between one side and the other. We've heard last night of a tragic accident whereby rebels were destroyed by a coalition air force who had assumed that they were enemy because they were shooting at him. There's been another case where we've had a loyalist convoy hit by a NATO airstrike, and then children and women being killed by second-order effects with ammunition striking. So the problem of doing this is that with weapons, people get hurt, and NATO is very conscious to try to do as little damage as possible. It's not trying to intervene, and I think there will be very few people who honestly believe Gaddafi's line that this is an attempt to reinvade and reoccupy Libya, or even that it's about Libya's oil. Quite frankly, it's not. The driving force within the White House was the memory within particularly the Department of State of the failure of the United Nations and particularly the US to intervene in Rwanda, and the absolute bloody carnage that was played out in graphic colour on our television screens. And a lot of people have said, not on my watch again. This was something that could be done relatively easy. It's nice and close to the coast, so it was ideal for a carrier operation to stop it. The problem is now where.
But so far it hasn't been that easy, and I want to put that point to Hamad Al Abdallah. While there is still this stalemate on the battlefield, where do you see this playing out over the coming days?
I mean, one of the things to, that will play out in the next few days is that the revolutionary forces have regrouped themselves. They have changed the leadership on the ground. They've put some mandates on the ground now to better control what's happening, because you have to keep in mind these forces have basically been put together within less than 3 or 4 weeks. And I think one of the things that we will also see on the ground is some better equipment and weaponry arriving for the revolutionary forces, even though on very small scales. I think also if the NATO forces continue to enforce or actually even escalate the enforcement of Resolution 1973, which does include the protection of civilians, okay, and that's very clearly stated in that. If that does happen, I think you will see the revolutionary forces moving further west.
And
one of the other things I think you will see even more defections.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we are going to have to leave it there. We are out of time, but I want to thank all three of our guests for taking part in the discussion. Seamus Milne, Mohammed Al Abdullah, and James Spencer. Gentlemen, thanks very much for your time. I'm sure we could spend a lot more talking about it, but unfortunately we don't have it. So we want to thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. Remember, you can join the conversation online. Just email us anytime with your comments and suggestions at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From me, Hazem Sika, and the rest of the team, bye for now.